Training intensity. How hard should you be pushing within your workouts to make sure that you're getting the most amount of progress possible? Because that's what you're interested in, right? No one wants to do a shit ton of effort in the gym to get no return. So when it comes to training intensity, you really need to know where to pitch your level of effort in order to get the most amount of returns. Because there could be a point at which you're maybe pushing too much volume, you're pushing the intensity too much, and actually that starts to work against you. And maybe you don't build as much muscle as possible, as much as you want, as much as you think you deserve for the effort that you're putting in. So in today's episode of the show, we're going to be diving into a couple of concepts around intensity within your workouts, specifically RPE, which is rate of perceived exertion, and RIR, which is reps in reserve. And I'm going to dive into what those two concepts mean and also help you kind of figure out some practical solutions to training intensity that you can implement within your workouts. But before we get stuck into all of that, I just want to say a big thank you. A thank you to if you listen to this on the podcast, whether that's iTunes, Spotify, or wherever, or maybe you watch on YouTube, wherever it is that you consume this content. I just want to say thank you. Thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. It always means a lot to know that you're consuming this content and it's helping you as well. And also maybe you're being entertained along the way. So that's super, super cool. So sometimes it's hard to know what intensity even means. It's hard to know how to track it. When I say push the intensity or push hard, no one really knows what that means. That's not really that quantifiable. Is it a case of you go balls or ovaries to the wall for every different set that you do? Is that what intensity means? You have to be that intense for every workout? Or is there a more measured approach? Is there actually a way that we can quantify what intensity means and then start to adjust it and use it as a variable within our training to elicit the most amount of muscle growth possible? Now, you could also say I imagine you've heard the term failure, pushing to failure. Now, again, what does that even mean? It means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. Does it mean that failure is concentric failure? So when you are bench pressing, you can no longer lift the bar off your chest and it crashes into your sternum? Maybe not quite that extreme, but you get the drift, that concentric failure. But is that absolute failure? Is absolute failure to do with concentric and eccentric failure as well, being pushed maybe by a training partner or doing some form of different repetition structure or protocol that enables you to push past that point? What does failure actually mean? So I feel like we need to define some terms here so that we're all singing off the same hymn sheet, as the crap fucking idiom is pertains to. So let's talk about some of these different things. But let's also first talk about some flaws. Now, intensity to me is referring to the amount of muscular tension, the bone-on-bone tension that you're creating over a given period of time, so that, and to the point where you're getting closer to concentric failure. That's, to me, that's the intensity. How close are you pushing towards concentric failure and still maintaining that bone-to-bone tension? That's kind of what intensity means to me. Now, that definition could be wildly different to some other coach or industry professional that you might see, and they might be absolutely right within the context that they use that specific term. Again, one of these things, as with some of the things with nutrition, there's sometimes no right or wrong answer. There's lots of different ways to skin a cat, lots of different ways to shred a human, and lots of different ways to build some fucking muscle. So intensity, that's what I mean. It's the amount of tension you're creating on the muscle and how close you're getting to concentric failure within a given set. Now, the other thing that is a flaw in this whole argument is your ability to contract a muscle. Now, your ability to contract a muscle may be very different to mine. You might be slightly more advanced than me and therefore able to contract your muscles more effectively than I am. You might be a beginner, so your ability to contract a muscle is very, very poor, let's say, or it's a learning curve that you're going through. So regardless of the number that I give you in terms of intensity means this number, do this, whether that's rate of perceived exertion or whether that's reps in reserve, it could actually mean something different in practical terms. So get two people and say, go to within X amount of reps to concentric failure. Now, even though they did that, well, actually their ability to create tension on that muscle may be very, very different. So one person's intensity could be completely different to another's, even though reps were the same, intensity measures were the same, and all of those different variables were trying to be accounted for. So there are inherent flaws with some of these processes that we're going to be talking through. So don't necessarily take everything as gospel, and as soon as I've said it or you've implemented it in your training, that can never be changed and it's always right. There's always room for tweaks and adjustments, and understanding that all this stuff is not necessarily always an exact science. The other thing is that humans are really bad at assessing where their limits are. So we're going to be talking a lot about failure, this concept of concentric failure. So when you can't lift that weight anymore, you've kind of failed to contract the muscle. That's concentric failure. Now, beginners typically who maybe have not lifted very much, or maybe not lifted very often, or someone who is quite well trained but actually doesn't train properly and has never contracted a muscle properly, then your knowledge or your understanding of how far you can push your limits, of where that point of failure is, may be actually very different to reality. You may not know that you got 3 or 4 more reps in you before you get to that failure point. You might feel that you've stopped and you can't lift anymore, but that actually might not be the case. It may be the case that if someone was standing there with you and just shouted at you and said, lift 1 more fucking time, you might do it. Who knows? So I think that those 3 things are probably the biggest flaws that we face when we're talking about intensity and trying to put some metrics around it. So understanding that, let's move on to the 2 concepts. So you've got rate of perceived exertion. Now, rate of perceived exertion's got many different ways, many different scales of measuring it. Some are just really, really abstract and a little bit fucking weird, but we're going to leave those to one side and we're going to talk about basically 1 to 10. Fucking easy, right? So let's move on to talk about the 2 concepts of intensity and how you measure them. So the first one is rate of perceived exertion. Now, this is basically, you've got many different scales, many different ways of measuring RPE. I'm going to ignore the ones that are a little bit weird because that might just fuck with your head. So let's still stick to something very, very simple, which is basically 1 to 10. 10 being balls to the wall. That's all your effort. That's max effort. That's going as hard as you possibly can to complete concentric failure. Awesome. Boom. That's 10. Then you've got 1, which is basically freaking hell. You just sat and just lifted, I don't know, the lightest weight you could possibly find. And he barely did it for a rep. Who knows? So what I find here is like 10 is this absolute limit. And when you're talking about this rate of perceived exertion, I think personally, and this is my personal view, this is again not like science-based or anything like that, this is my personal view from what I see, is that people are very good at judging the extremes. So people are good at judging what's max effort and what's fuck all effort. They're very good at that. They can kind of do that. They can say, right, go all out. Right, okay, I could do that, go. Now if I said do an 8, then what does that mean? A lot of people get confused with that. And then what's the difference between a 7 and an 8? Again, it's more of an abstract concept that what is that rate of perceived exertion? Who kind of knows? It's hard to quantify. So when you see on a workout program, rate of perceived exertion, 7, what does that actually mean? I'm not sure I even fucking know what that means. Let's be honest with you. That's why I don't fucking use it. So what I do use, now when I say I do use this, I don't use it with every client. Sometimes I leave it just for my higher intermediate / advanced clients. It just depends on the person. Mainly for beginners, I just get them to work in a kind of slightly different way. But we're going to stick to now using these terms for intensity measurement. So this is reps in reserve, RIR. So this is basically how many reps you've got left in the tank. If at the point at which you're doing a bench press, you're lifting the bar off your chest and you can't lift it any further, and that's basically now going to crash into your chest if you don't re-rack it. That basically is concentric failure. Now, reps in reserve say, well, how many reps are we going to leave in the tank before that happens? So you might say in a program, 4 reps in reserve. So you're going to stop 4 reps before that point at which the bar is going to crash into your chest. You might say it's 3 reps in reserve, 2, 1, and then 0 being that you're going for concentric failure, which you might need a spotter or you might need to quite advance to be able to re-rack that when you get to that concentric failure point. Now, the reason why I prefer this method, and again, this is just personal, this is nothing like it's particularly science-based to say, evidence says that RPE is not as good as RIR. This is just my way of, I think it helps people put stuff into practice. And that's kind of what we're here for, right? You want information that you can fucking use. You just don't want shit going into your head and then you can't actually put it into practice. You want to know practical stuff, right? So I feel like you can logically progress intensity when you are using reps in reserve. So for example, I could say, right, for the first 4 weeks of your program, work within 3 to 4 reps in reserve. Then in the second block, we might say work within 2 to 3. In the third block, I might say 1 to 2. So I've logically increased the intensity of that program, plus I might add volume in with sets and all that sort of good stuff as well. So I'm able to manage that more easily. And the person that I'm working with, the client that I'm working with, would be more in tune with understanding what I fucking mean when I write it down. So in terms of implementing this, if you wanted to implement reps in reserve into your training program, what I would recommend you do is I would have this sort of priming phase, let's say, and that doesn't have to be very long, 1, 2 weeks, something like that, in this specific scenario. There might be a case for doing a priming phase slightly longer if it incorporates a certain nutrition strategy and so on and so forth. But anyway, let's just stick to this. Now, what you could do is say, well, I'm just going to test where my failure point is for the given exercises within my program. Let's stick with bench press, for example. So you might say, well, the given rep range that we're working in for this particular part of the program is the 8 to 10 rep ranges. So you might say, well, okay, what weight can I use to get to 8 reps for concentric failure? So that might then be, you're setting that point. Or you might say, well, what weight can I get to 10 repetitions? And that be concentric failure. So then you know from that point what weight you can lift and get 10 reps, then that's complete failure. Now what you're going to say is, okay, well, I need to pull that weight back a bit if I'm going to get 10 reps and still be a few short of reps in reserve. So it might take you a few little trial and error opportunities for you to be able to figure out where that point's going to be. So it's going to take that little bit of adjustment of saying, right, okay, this is the weight that I can lift, 10 repetitions, concentric failure. So I need to pull the weight a little bit back and maybe like retest that point. So it's just going to take that 1 to 2 weeks, maybe a couple of workouts just to find where that point is. And then, like I said, you are really going to kind of just start to logically progress. If you're in a 12-week training block, I would generally start right back at maybe 3 to 4 reps in reserve, maybe even 3 to 5 reps in reserve. Then in 4 weeks later, you up that intensity, reduce the amount of reps in reserve, and then do the same in the final 4 weeks. So you're always adjusting and accounting for that intensity, but you're doing it in a way that is understandable, either for yourself or for the person that I would potentially be coaching. Now, if you're an absolute beginner, then maybe you don't want to start off at that level of intensity. You might want to double all of those numbers. So 3 to 4 reps in reserve, or even 3 to 5, maybe you're pushing like 8 to 10 reps in reserve. You really are pulling back that weight because you are trying to mainly focus on the skill of executing the movement, executing the exercise correctly, being safe, and kind of understanding what it means to contract a muscle. You are kind of at that point, you are Bambi on ice, trying to find your way through the gym. So you don't want to be loading up the intensity at the point you're trying to learn stuff. And if you are a total beginner as well, you can build muscle by basically just fucking doing some exercise, bike and jumping around a fucking bit. So the fact that you're working this at this level that's under quite low on the intensity scale doesn't really make a huge amount of difference. You're still probably going to build some muscle, But then as your skill level improves and you can start to contract a muscle, then you can start to increase the intensity. If you do that before you can do all of that sort of stuff, it's not really going to work out for you that well, may even risk injury as well. So to summarize this one for you, there are a couple of different ways in which you can measure intensity within your workouts. RPE, reps in reserve. Personally, I would always go for reps in reserve, but you could use RPE. You could even use both if you really, really want to. I just find reps in reserve a little bit more practical, something you can get your head around, and something more measurable and more, you can kind of get it a little bit sooner, I find anyway. But use your own judgment as to what you feel is right for you. Then think about assessing where that reps in reserve point is, what weight you're going to lift, and then start to progress it over the course of your periodized training program if that's how you set up your training. But remember, all of these different options do have flaws. Your ability to contract a muscle is very, very key. You can't neglect that. Intensity doesn't just mean lifting weight. It's all about bone-to-bone mechanical tension. So whether you're man, woman, or beast, that's what you're trying to do. You're trying to increase that tension. If you are pushing the intensity and that's compromising your ability to create tension, then arguably you're not really making that exercise more intense. So the two things have to go in conjunction. You have to be pulling your intensity up by maintaining mechanical tension, but also making sure that you are getting maybe closer and closer and closer to that point of concentric failure, whether you then, smash your chest in with a bar. Don't do that, kids. Don't do that. Be safe in the gym. Be streetwise. So I hope you enjoyed this episode of the show. If you did, then I would love to hear what you've got to say. Maybe you can even fly over to Instagram at iron_paradise_fitness. Drop me a DM, maybe comment on a post. Let me know what you think. If I've helped, if I've hindered, hopefully you're not hindered. And if maybe I've entertained you, then feel free to come and let me know. And also, as I mentioned right back at the start, you can use the calorie calculator and download a free training program if you want to get started on a journey to a leaner, healthier life. That's all there for you. But for now, all I'm going to say is thanks so much for listening. Keep living the lean life, and I'll see you for the next episode of the show.